The air in the Evans household had been thick with secrets for weeks, a heavy, silent blanket that everyone tiptoed around but no one mentioned. To Leo, it felt like the quiet moment right before a thunderstorm, when the light goes a strange color and the birds stop singing. He was used to the normal sounds of home, the hum of the dishwasher, the distant chatter of a TV, his mother's occasional call from the kitchen. But this was different. This was a planned, careful quiet, the kind where words were measured and glances were exchanged over his head, conversations halting the moment he walked into a room. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in his latest project, a balsa wood bridge designed with such intricate, interlocking pieces that it required all his concentration. But the silence had a weight to it, and it was pressing down on him. It was a Tuesday evening, a completely ordinary Tuesday, which is why the extraordinary thing that happened felt so loud. He was on his way to the kitchen for a glass of water, his socks making no sound on the plush hallway carpet. His parents' study door, which was almost always firmly shut, was tonight not quite closed. A sliver of warm yellow light cut across the dark hallway floor. And from that sliver, voices, low and tense, slipped out into the quiet house. He would have walked right past, lost in thoughts of trusses and supports, if he hadn't heard his own name. It was his father's voice, strained and tired in a way Leo wasn't used to. "And we simply don't have it, Sarah. The savings are gone after Maya's last semester. The down payment on the venue alone is $25,000. It's impossible." Leo froze, his hand pausing on the banister. He became a statue in the hallway, his breath held. His mother's voice replied, softer, but laced with a sharp anxiety. "It has to be perfect, John. It's her day. She's been dreaming of this since she was a little girl. All her friends are there, his family. What will they think if we scale it back? It will look like we can't provide for her." "We can't provide for her," his father's voice came back, a little louder, a frustrated hiss. "Not for $100,000 party. We're not made of money. The credit is maxed out. There's nothing left to leverage." There was a long pause. Leo could hear the heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second echoing in his ears. His heart was starting to beat a strange, nervous rhythm. $100,000? For a wedding? The number was so huge, it was meaningless to him, like the distance to a star. He thought of the $50 in his own savings jar, money he'd been painstakingly saving for a new, professional model-building toolkit. It had taken him over a year. His mother's voice broke the silence again, so quiet now that Leo had to lean closer to the door, his ear almost touching the wood. The words were hesitant, as if she herself couldn't believe she was saying them. There is one asset. The only one left that's unencumbered." "What?" his father asked, his tone flat with exhaustion. "The apartment," she whispered. The word landed in Leo's stomach like a stone. His apartment. The one his grandparents on his mom's side had left for him in their will. It was a small one-bedroom in a quiet building across town. It wasn't fancy, but to Leo it was a magical thing. It was his future. His parents had always talked about it. "When you're older, Leo, you'll have your own place. That apartment is your head start, son." It was the one thing in his life that was truly, completely his. "Sarah, we can't," his father said, and there was real shock in his voice. "That's Leo's. That's his inheritance. My parents left that for him." "It's just bricks and mortar," his mother's voice was desperate now, pleading. "He's 12, John. He doesn't need it for a decade or more. By then, we can save again, we can help him. But Maya needs this now. This is her moment. This is about family, about supporting each other. Leo would understand eventually. He loves his sister." Leo felt a coldness spread through his chest. He couldn't move. "It's just bricks and mortar." But it wasn't. It was the treehouse he'd imagined building on its tiny balcony. It was the place where he'd finally have a room big enough for all his models. It was his own front door. His father was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, defeated. The equity in it would just about cover the wedding. Maybe a little more. But we'd have to list it immediately. The realtor said the market is hot right now. Then it's the only way, his mother said, her tone final, as if she were convincing herself as much as him. We'll do it.
For Maya.
For the family. We won't tell Leo until it's all over. It would only upset him, and he's too young to understand the complexities of these things. It's better this way. The decision was made. In a hushed conversation behind a nearly closed door, his future had been traded for a single day.
For a party.
4 fancy chairs and flower arrangements, and what other people might think. Leo stood there in the dark hallway, the world tilting sideways. The trust he had in his parents, the solid ground he'd always taken for granted, had just crumbled away beneath his feet. He wasn't upset. He was shattered. He backed away from the door, silent as a ghost, and retreated to his room, the thirst for water completely forgotten, replaced by a much deeper, much colder ache. The secret was out, and now it belonged to him, a heavy, painful truth he had to carry all alone. The storm hadn't just arrived, it had already leveled everything. The days that followed the secret in the study did not turn into a loud, dramatic explosion as Leo had half expected, half feared they might. Instead, they became a slow, meticulous performance, a play where everyone knew their lines except him, and he was forced to be both the audience and a silent, unwilling participant. The heaviness in the air didn't lift. It simply changed shape, morphing from a secretive silence into a bustling, purposeful energy that completely excluded him. It was like watching his own family prepare for a grand voyage on a ship he wasn't allowed to board, all while they were quietly selling his lifeboat to pay for their first-class tickets. The first tangible change was the sudden, constant presence of his sister, Maya. Her visits home, which used to be sporadic and filled with complaints about her tiny apartment and her busy social life, were now a daily occurrence. She would burst through the front door, not with a hello, but with a whirlwind of fabric swatches, glossy brochures, and a voice pitched several notes higher with excitement. The kitchen table, once a place for homework and simple family meals, was permanently buried under a landslide of wedding planning. There were catalogs for cakes with 5 tiers and intricate sugar flowers, menus featuring foods with names Leo couldn't pronounce, and color palettes with shades like blush and mauve that all looked suspiciously like pink to him. His parents were no longer quiet and worried. They were now busy and deferential. That was the word Leo found in a book, and it fit perfectly. His father, who usually grumbled about the cost of a new video game, would now listen intently as Maya explained why it was absolutely vital to have custom-printed cocktail napkins for the reception. His mother, who would tell Leo to turn off lights to save on the electricity bill, would nod without a hint of concern as Maya debated the merits of having a raw seafood bar versus a mashed potato bar. "It's her day, Leo," his mother would say to him with a strange smile if he ever looked confused by the extravagance. "We want it to be perfect." The words felt like a rehearsed line, a mantra they used to justify the growing mountain of decisions that all seemed to circle back to one thing, an astonishing amount of money. Leo watched it all from the sidelines, a silent observer in his own home. He tried, once, to breach the subject. It was a Saturday morning. Maya was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by pictures of elaborate floral arches. "Mom," Leo said, his voice sounding small. "What about the apartment?" "My apartment." The question landed in the room like a dropped plate. The chatter stopped. His mother's smile became fixed, a little too wide. His father suddenly found something incredibly interesting to look at on the ceiling. "Oh, honey," his mother said, walking over and putting a hand on his shoulder. It felt patronizing, not comforting. "That's all such grown-up, complicated stuff. You don't need to worry your head about it. That's for Dad and me to handle." "But I heard you talking," Leo started, a spark of defiance flaring. His father cut him off, his tone firm, final. "Leo, that's enough. You must have misheard. Adult finances are private. We're taking care of it. We're taking care of everything. Your job is to just be a good brother and be happy for Maya." The message was clear, and it was a dismissal sharper than any anger. He was too young. He wouldn't understand. His feelings, his concerns, his future, they were all complicated stuff that paled in comparison to the immediate, glittering urgency of the wedding. The injustice of it burned in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Arguing was pointless. They had already made their choice, and their choice was to pretend it didn't matter. He began to notice other things, small confirmations of the secret he carried. The hushed phone calls his father took in the garage, talking about listings and open houses. The way his parents would quickly change the subject or turn down the TV news when a segment about the housing market came on. The official-looking letters that arrived in the mail with the logo of a real estate company, which his mother would swiftly snatch from the mailbox and hide. Meanwhile, the price tag of Maya's perfect day seemed to inflate with every passing hour. The band wasn't just a band. It was a sought-after 9-piece ensemble. The photographer wasn't a photographer. He was a visual storyteller with a waiting list. Each new decision was another brick paid for with the money from his apartment, another piece of his future foundation being chipped away to build a single, fleeting moment. The worst part was the loneliness. He was surrounded by his family, but he had never felt more alone. They were all participants in a grand lie of omission, and he was the only one who knew the truth of it. He felt like a ghost in his own home, watching his family live a life he was no longer truly a part of. The trust was broken. The promise of the apartment, the symbol of his grandparents' love and his own head start in life, had been liquidated, turned into a deposit for a DJ and a chocolate fountain. He didn't feel angry anymore. Anger was a hot, fast emotion. This was colder, heavier. This was a profound sense of betrayal that settled deep into his bones, a quiet, icy knowledge that he could only rely on himself. His family had sold his future, and in doing so, they had sold something else, something just as valuable, his belief that they would always, always protect what was his. The feeling of betrayal, cold and heavy as a stone in his gut, began to curdle into something else inside Leo. It wasn't the hot, flashy anger that makes you yell and slam doors. This was quieter, sharper, and more focused. It was a deep, simmering sense of injustice that needed an outlet, a purpose. Moping in his room felt useless. Confronting his parents again was clearly a dead end. They had built a wall of adult business, and you wouldn't understand that he couldn't scale. He was trapped with this enormous, painful secret, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. He felt like one of his own model buildings, with a fundamental support beam secretly removed, teetering on the verge of a silent, internal collapse. He needed to talk to someone. But who? His friends at school would just shrug. Their biggest worries were homework and weekend plans. They lived in a world where parents were the providers of snacks and rides to soccer practice, not thieves of futures. He needed an adult, but one who wasn't part of the ecosystem of his family, one who wouldn't immediately dismiss him or, worse, report his feelings back to his parents with a patronizing, "Oh, Leo's just having a little sulk about the wedding." His eyes drifted to his bedroom window, which looked out over the backyard. Beyond the fence was the neighboring house, a neat, tidy home with a perfectly organized tool shed and a garden where the tomatoes grew in impossibly straight lines. That was Mr. Henderson's house. Mr. Henderson was different. He was old, retired, and always seemed to be puttering in his garage, which was less a place for cars and more a museum of fascinating projects. He had helped Leo fix a broken remote control car once, not by just doing it for him, but by showing him how the gears worked and explaining why the solder had come loose. He spoke to Leo not like he was a kid, but like he was a fellow tinkerer, a person with a brain that was capable of understanding things. Taking a deep breath, Leo slipped out the back door, across the lawn, and through the gap in the fence he used when retrieving stray soccer balls. He found Mr. Henderson at his workbench, carefully polishing the brass fittings of an ancient, beautiful sextant. He looked up over his glasses as Leo approached. "Leo," he said, his voice a calm, steady rumble. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Here to borrow a socket wrench again." Leo shook his head, his throat suddenly too tight to speak. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking at the sawdust on the floor. Mr. Henderson put down his polishing cloth and turned fully on his stool. He didn't say anything else. He just waited, his silence an open invitation. And then it all came out. The words tumbled from Leo's mouth in a rushed, jumbled torrent. The overheard conversation, the apartment, the $100,000 wedding, the dismissive replies from his parents, the feeling of being invisible and unimportant in his own family. He didn't cry. He spoke with a fierce, frustrated energy, his hands finally coming out of his pockets to gesture helplessly at the sheer unfairness of it all. And they just keep saying I'm too young to understand, he finished, his voice cracking slightly. But I do understand. I understand that something that was mine is being sold for a party. How is that not stealing? Mr. Henderson listened through it all without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell Leo to respect his parents. When Leo was finally spent, the old man was quiet for a long moment, looking at the intricate instrument in his hands. A sextant, he said finally, holding it up. It's for navigation. For finding your way when you're lost at sea, with no land in sight. You have to use the stars. You have to find fixed points in a vast, empty sky to figure out where you are. He set it down and looked directly at Leo. What your parents did, Leo, was wrong. It was a profound breach of trust. You have every right to feel betrayed. The desire for revenge is a natural human reaction to a wound like that. It's the mind's way of seeking balance, of trying to correct scales that have been tipped violently against you. Leo blinked, surprised by the word. Revenge. He hadn't even let himself think it, but it was exactly the dark, simmering feeling in his chest. But, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice low and serious, most revenge is like setting off a bomb in your own house to get back at the person who stole your furniture. It destroys everything, including you. It's loud, it's messy, and it leaves nothing but rubble. What you need isn't that kind of revenge. What you need is a different kind of navigation. You need to find a way to make them see. Not to hurt them, but to make them truly understand the weight of what they've done. To hold up a mirror so clear and so bright that they cannot possibly look away from their own actions. He gestured around the garage, at the shelves of tools, the half-finished projects, the rolls of blueprints. You're a builder, Leo. You understand materials. You understand structure and cause and effect. You don't fight with fists or shouts. You fight with what you know. You fight by creating something so honest, so undeniable, that it becomes the truth they've been trying to avoid. A plan, vague and formless just moments before, began to crystallize in Leo's mind. It wasn't about yelling. It wasn't about getting the apartment back. That was likely impossible. It was about translation. It was about taking this huge, complicated, financial betrayal and translating it into a language his family could not possibly ignore. He needed to make the invisible visible. He needed to build the ghost of the future they had sold. A slow, determined light replaced the helpless anger in Leo's eyes. He looked at Mr. Henderson, a silent question hanging between them. The old man gave a single, slight nod. This garage is at your disposal, he said simply. And my help if you need it. But the plan, the creation that has to be yours. It has to come from you. For the first time in weeks, the heavy stone in Leo's gut felt less like an anchor and more like a foundation. The path wasn't clear yet, but the compass was set. He had a fixed point. He had a purpose. He wasn't a powerless kid anymore. He was an architect, and he was about to design the truth. The garage became a sanctuary, a secret world of sawdust and possibility that existed entirely outside the glittering frenzy of the Evans household. Stepping into Mr. Henderson's space was like crossing a border into a different country, one where logic, patience, and craftsmanship were the only laws. The air here smelled of pine, oil, and old paper, a stark and comforting contrast to the cloying scent of perfume samples and floral catalogs that now permeated his own home. This was Leo's laboratory, his fortress, and his therapy. The first step was the blueprint, not just in his mind, but on paper. Mr. Henderson provided large sheets of drafting paper, the kind real architects used, and a set of fine pencils. For 3 evenings after school, Leo didn't touch a single tool. He sat at the old oak desk in the corner of the garage, under the warm glow of a green-shaded lamp, and he drew. This wasn't a childish sketch. This was a labor of meticulous, almost obsessive, detail. He drew the floor plan of his dream future home, the one he'd imagined living in after college, the one the apartment was supposed to help buy. He designed a living room with a huge window for light, precisely calculating the scale. He mapped out a kitchen with an island, a bedroom with a deep closet for all his models, and a special study nook with built-in shelves. He drew the furniture, a sofa, a bed, a desk, and then, in a moment of inspiration, he drew tiny versions of his favorite model ships on the shelves. He was not just building a house, he was building a life. With the plans approved by Mr. Henderson's experienced eye, a solid foundation plan, Leo. Very important. The real work began. The procurement of materials was a mission in itself. Leo emptied his savings jar, the one that had been meant for the professional toolkit. The $50 felt insignificant next to $100,000, but it was his, and that made it powerful. He and Mr. Henderson took a trip to the art supply store and the local hobby shop. They didn't buy pre-made model kits. That would be too easy, too fake. Instead, they bought raw materials. Sheets of balsa wood in various thicknesses, stronger basswood for structural supports, tiny tubes of wood glue that required the steady hand of a surgeon, acrylic paints in small pots, a set of miniature brushes with just a few hairs each, and a new, incredibly sharp hobby knife with a warning from Mr. Henderson about respecting the blade. Then, the construction commenced. It was painstaking, frustrating, and utterly absorbing. After school, under the guise of playing at a friend's house, Leo would slip into the garage. The sounds of his world became the gentle scratch-scratch of sandpaper smoothing a rough edge, the soft snick of the knife blade slicing through wood grain, the faint tap of a tiny piece being pressed into place. He built the house from the ground up, just like a real one. He glued down floorboards, individually, cutting each tiny strip to length. He erected walls, ensuring they were perfectly plumb. He measured and remeasured every window opening, every doorframe. His fingers grew sore, and a permanent smudge of glue settled on his thumb and forefinger. Mr. Henderson was a silent partner, a master guiding an apprentice. He didn't do the work for Leo. He taught him. When a wall was unstable, he showed Leo how to create a simple buttress. When Leo struggled with the pitch of the roof, he brought out a book on basic architecture, and they studied trusses together. He taught him how to mix paints to get the exact shade of gray for the roof tiles, how to dry brush to create the illusion of weathered wood on the miniature front door. It was the most focused Leo had ever been in his life. Every tiny window pane, cut from a clear plastic report cover, was an act of defiance. Every shingle, meticulously glued in overlapping rows, was a word in a speech he was preparing. The model house grew, layer by layer, detail by detail, and with each passing hour, the cold knot of betrayal in his chest loosened just a little, transformed into the heat of concentration. He created a family for this house. Using Sculpey clay, he made 2 tiny figures to represent his future self and a future, blurry-faced friend. He made a ridiculously small dog. He built a miniature version of his current favorite model spaceship and placed it on the desk in the study, a piece of his present self living in this future world. He painted books on the shelves, their spines no bigger than a grain of rice. He was populating a ghost world, giving life to the future that had been erased on a spreadsheet somewhere. Weeks bled into a month. The wedding plans at home reached a fever pitch. There were dress fittings in the living room, cake tastings that covered the kitchen counters, and endless debates over playlists. Leo would move through it all like a silent ghost, absorbing the sounds of his sister's extravagant future, all while secretly, diligently building the quiet, simple future they had taken from him. He was exhausted, often working late into the evening under the garage's single bare bulb, but he never wavered. This project was no longer just about revenge. It was about proof. It was about making the intangible tangible. He was building the truth, and it was going to be perfect. The morning of Maya's wedding dawned bright and painfully clear, a day so perfectly orchestrated by weather it felt like just another purchased item on the extravagant checklist. Inside the Evans house, The air vibrated with a frantic, high-pitched energy. It was a symphony of chaos. The shriek of a hair straightener, the rustle of expensive fabric, the clatter of high heels on hardwood, and the constant, overloud laughter that comes from pure, unadulterated stress. The entire house smelled like hairspray, perfume, and wilting bouquets of lilies. To Leo, moving through the whirlwind to get a glass of orange juice, it felt like being inside a beehive that had been poked with a very expensive stick. He observed it all with a strange, detached calm. He saw his mother, her face pinched with anxiety, trying to pin a corsage onto his father's trembling lapel. He saw his father, pale and sweating in his unfamiliar tuxedo, looking like a man being led to his own financial execution rather than his daughter's wedding. And he saw Maya, a vision in blinding white satin, surrounded by a flock of chattering bridesmaids, her face a mask of radiant, entitled joy. She was the sun at the center of this expensive solar system, and everyone else, including Leo, was just a planet forced into her orbit for the day. No one really looked at him. He was an accessory, the young brother who needed to be dressed and presentable, a minor character in the grand production of Maya's day. This suited Leo perfectly. His own personal production was waiting, shrouded under an old paint-stained sheet in the corner of Mr. Henderson's garage. The final touches had been applied late into the previous night, a final coat of varnish on the hardwood floors he'd crafted, a last, microscopic bookshelf placed just so. The model was complete. It was a perfect, breathtaking, heartbreaking diorama of a life that would never be. And today, it would have its premiere. The wedding ceremony itself was a blur of organ music, overly long vows, and the rustle of 200 guests. Leo sat stiffly between his parents, his own cheap suit itching his neck. He didn't listen to the words about love and commitment and building a future together. All he could think about was the foundation that had been poured for this moment, a foundation made of broken promises and the bricks of his stolen apartment. He watched Maya and her new husband, Mark, kiss, and the crowd erupted in applause. It was the sound of approval, of celebration for the beautiful, expensive lie. The reception was held in a vast, lavishly decorated hall. It was everything Maya had ever wanted. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, centerpieces so large they prevented people from seeing each other across the tables, a band so loud conversation was impossible. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and expensive wine. Leo watched as tray after tray of elaborate canapés circulated, each one costing what he guessed was probably $20. He did the math in his head. $20 times 200 guests, and that was just the tiny snacks before the actual dinner. The numbers were so vast they were meaningless, yet each one was a tiny shard of his future. He waited. He bided his time through the salad course. He pushed his seared salmon around his plate during the main course. He watched Maya and Mark have their first dance, a spectacle of spinning white fabric and flashing professional lights. He listened to the toasts, full of jokes he didn't understand, and praise for his parents' generosity. The hypocrisy of it all was a bitter taste in his mouth, sharper than any fancy food. Finally, the moment arrived. The band took a break, and the DJ started playing softer background music. It was the lull, the time when gifts were traditionally presented. The massive table at the back of the room was already piled high with gleaming boxes and oversized envelopes. This was his window. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, not with nervousness, but with a cold, clear certainty. He slipped away from the table unnoticed. He made his way out a side door, across the now empty valet parking area, and to Mr. Henderson's garage. The model, under its sheet, was heavier than it looked, but he carried it carefully, his arms wrapped around the sturdy base Mr. Henderson had helped him build. It was a solid, weighty thing, full of purpose. Walking back into the reception felt like walking onto a stage. The noise and the light hit him like a wall. He weaved through the tables, the sheet-draped object in his arms drawing a few curious glances. He walked right up to the head table, where Maya, Mark, and his parents were laughing, flushed with wine and admiration. The music was low. The moment was right. He set the model down carefully on the edge of the gift table, its presence and mysterious next to the shiny packages. He turned to face the room. He didn't have a microphone, but he didn't need one. He simply raised his voice, a clear, pre-adolescent sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Excuse me?"
Everyone, he said.
The chatter dipped. A few people turned. Then a few more. His parents looked up, their smiles confused. Maya's smile was annoyed at the interruption. "I made a gift for Maya," Leo continued, his voice not shaking, but ringing with a strange, formal clarity. "To show how much I love my family." He saw his mother's face soften into a patronizing, "Isn't that sweet?" expression. This was the moment. He reached down and, with a single, fluid motion, pulled away the paint-stained sheet. The gasps were instantaneous. It wasn't a gasp of polite appreciation. It was a gasp of genuine, stunned awe. The model house was exquisite. The afternoon sun streaming through the hall's windows caught the tiny windows he'd so carefully made, making them gleam. The intricate detail was visible even from a distance: the individual shingles, the textured bricks, the perfectly scaled front door. It was a masterpiece of patience and love. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the incredible creation. They were waiting for the sweet story behind it. Leo looked directly at his parents. He looked at Maya. And he delivered his speech, every word falling into the silent room like a drop of ice water. "This is the house I wanted to build one day," he said, his voice still calm, still clear. "It was going to be paid for by the apartment my grandparents gave me." He saw his father's face go ashen. His mother's hand flew to her mouth. "But my parents sold my apartment to pay for this wedding." The silence in the room became absolute. You could hear the clink of a glass from the kitchen 100 feet away. The awe on the guests' faces twisted into shock, then into dawning, uncomfortable understanding. Leo's final sentence was not shouted. It was delivered with a devastating, simple honesty. "So, this model is all I have left of my future. I hope your wedding was worth it." He did not cry. He did not yell. He simply placed the sheet neatly on the table beside the model, turned and walked away. He left behind a perfect, silent bomb of truth, sitting in the middle of the glittering, expensive wreckage of his sister's perfect day. The damage was not done with fists or fury. It was done with craft, with patience, and with the unbearable weight of a truth, finally spoken aloud. The silence Leo left in his wake was not a peaceful one. It was a thick, suffocating, and profoundly shocked void, so complete and heavy it seemed to swallow the very air from the lavishly decorated hall. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 200 guests were frozen in their seats, their faces a gallery of stunned expressions, jaws slack, eyes wide, forks hovering halfway to open mouths. The beautiful, expensive dream of the wedding had just been violently punctured, and the raw, ugly truth was hissing out for everyone to see. All eyes, wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, slowly pivoted from the breathtaking model house, this monument to a stolen future, to the head table where the perpetrators of that theft sat exposed. The first sound to break the silence was a sharp, choked gasp from Leo's mother, her hand still pressed against her mouth as if physically holding in a scream. Her face, moments before flushed with pride and wine, had drained to a sickly, ghostly white. Her eyes were fixed on the model, but she wasn't seeing its craftsmanship. She was seeing her own betrayal, reflected back at her with excruciating clarity. It was no longer a private, justifiable family decision hidden behind closed doors. It was a public fact, laid bare for her friends, her family, her neighbors, and her new in-laws to judge. The weight of their collective gaze felt like physical pressure, crushing her into her chair. Next to her, Leo's father seemed to have aged a decade in 10 seconds. His shoulders, squared in his rented tuxedo, slumped forward as if all the bones had been removed from his body. He stared at his half-empty wine glass, unable to lift his eyes to meet anyone's stare. The shame was a hot, crawling sensation on his skin. His son hadn't misheard. He'd known all along. He'd carried this enormous, painful secret while they'd pretended everything was fine, while they told him to be happy and not worry his little head about adult matters. The memory of those dismissals now felt like the cruelest acts of all. He had treated his son's rightful concern as a childish nuisance, and now the entire world could see it. But the most volcanic reaction came from Maya. The radiant, blissful mask of the beautiful bride shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the furious, humiliated woman beneath. Her face, carefully made up by a professional artist, contorted with a rage so pure it was almost terrifying. Her perfect day, her moment in the sun, had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. The whispers started then, a low, rustling wave of sound sweeping through the tables. They weren't whispers of admiration for her dress or her flowers. They were whispers of scandal. They sold his inheritance? $100,000 wedding? How could they not tell him? She could feel the judgment, the pity, the gossip, and it was a poison seeping into the very fabric of her white satin gown. How dare he, she finally spat out, her voice a strangled shriek that cut through the murmuring. She wasn't looking at the model. She was glaring at the space where Leo had been, her eyes blazing with tears of fury. He ruined it. He ruined my entire wedding. That selfish, horrible little brat. She was still trapped in her own universe, where her party was the only thing that mattered. But even as she said it, the words sounded hollow and ugly in the new, truth-soaked atmosphere of the room. A few of her bridesmaids shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet her eye. The spell was broken. The party was over. The band, looking deeply awkward, stopped pretending to tune their instruments. The waitstaff hovered near the kitchen doors, unsure whether to bring out the dessert. The vibrant, joyful energy that had filled the room was gone, replaced by a dense, uncomfortable awkwardness. Guests began to look at their watches, to make excuses to tablemates, to suddenly remember urgent appointments. The exodus started slowly, then gained momentum, a quiet, shuffling, mass retreat from the scene of the crime. There were no joyful goodbyes, no slaps on the back for the happy couple. There were only mumbled congratulations, averted eyes, and a swift, desperate rush for the exits. The grand celebration, the $100,000 fantasy, had collapsed into ruin, not with a bang, but with the devastating, echoing silence that had followed a 12-year-old boy's quiet, terrible truth. The price of the party was no longer just a financial figure on a bank statement. It was written on the ashamed faces of his parents, in the furious tears of his sister, and in the hurried, embarrassed departure of every single guest. The bill had finally come due, and it was far more expensive than anyone could have imagined. The house on Maple Street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had started this whole story. This wasn't the tense, secretive hush of whispered plans and hidden guilt. This was the heavy, exhausted, and deeply fragile quiet that comes after a great storm has passed, leaving everyone to survey the damage and wonder how, or even if, they can begin to rebuild. The glittering confetti of the wedding had been swept away, the extravagant flowers had wilted and been tossed out, but the mess that remained was invisible and far more complicated to clean up. For 3 days, a cold war raged within the walls of the Evans home. Maya had left for her honeymoon in a fury, her parting shots aimed at Leo, blaming him for poisoning her memories forever. Leo stayed in his room, not out of sadness now, but out of a firm, resolved silence. He had said everything he needed to say. The ball, as Mr. Henderson might put it, was in their court. He read books, he worked on a new, simple model just for fun this time, and he waited. The power had shifted. He was no longer the powerless child waiting for an explanation. He was the one who had spoken his truth, and now it was their turn to respond. The silence was finally broken on the 4th evening. His parents came into his room. They didn't call him down, they came to him. They sat on the edge of his bed, not like authorities, but like weary travelers who had lost their way. His mother's eyes were red-rimmed. His father's hands were clasped tightly together. "Leo," his father began, his voice rough with emotion. "There is no excuse for what we did.
None.
We were wrong. Not just about selling the apartment, but about how we treated you. We dismissed you. We lied to you. We made you feel like your future wasn't as important as Maya's present. And there is no way we can ever apologize enough for that. His mother nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. We got so caught up in the pressure of it all, what people would think, making Maya happy, that we lost sight of what was actually right. We failed you as your parents, Leo. We were supposed to protect your future, not auction it off for a party. They didn't offer excuses. They didn't say he was too young to understand. They offered a full, unconditional surrender to the truth. They described the shame they felt at the wedding, the horrible weight of everyone's knowing stares. They described the long, quiet talks they'd had with each other over the last few days, realizing the depth of the trust they had shattered. Then they presented a plan. It wasn't a magic wand that could bring the apartment back. Some things, once sold, are gone forever. But it was a plan to rebuild what they could. From this moment on, his father said, every spare dollar we have goes into a savings account for you. For your future. For college, for a car, for a down payment on a house one day. It will be your account, and we will show you the statements every month. No more secrets. His mother reached out and tentatively put her hand over his. And we're going to sell the ridiculous car your father only drives on weekends. And my jewelry that I never wear. It won't be $100,000, but it's a start. It's us proving to you, with actions and not just words, that we are going to make this right. Later that week, even Maya called. Her voice was different. The angry, spoiled tone was gone, replaced by a subdued, awkward humility. I'm sorry, Leo, she said, and for the first time, it sounded real. I was so obsessed with my perfect day that I didn't stop for 1 second to think about what it was costing everyone else. Especially you. What Mom and Dad did was terrible, and I should have been angry for you. Not just angry for myself. Your model. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I finally get it. The revenge was over, but it hadn't destroyed his family. Instead, Leo's brave, quiet act of truth had burned away the lies and the pretense, leaving behind something raw, damaged, but real. The new foundation of his family wasn't based on everything being perfect or everyone getting what they wanted. It was based on honesty, even when it was painful, and on accountability, and on the hard work of making things right after you've made a terrible mistake. They were poorer in money, but they were richer in understanding. Leo had learned that the strongest things aren't built quickly or easily, but piece by piece, with patience and truth, and sometimes you have to tear down the rotten parts before you can build something stronger in its place. And if you've ever felt like no one is listening, or that your voice is too small to be heard, remember Leo's story. Remember that the most powerful way to be heard isn't always by shouting the loudest, but by speaking your truth with such clarity and such purpose that the world has no choice but to stop and listen. Your story matters. Your voice matters. If you want to join us for more stories about finding courage, about fairness, and about the surprising ways we find our strength, make sure to subscribe. A new journey begins every time you hit that button.